On Friday, Canada's GDP data showed that the country is in a recession with 2 consecutive quarters of contraction.
And of course, this is terrible news for the 112,000 people who've lost their jobs in the first 3 months of this year alone.
Carney is under fire as Canada's economy is dragged into a painful recession, with 112,000 jobs reportedly wiped out in just months.
Polls suggest Canadians elected Carney in part because they thought he could manage trying economic times. Now he'll have to show that he can.
The pressure is mounting fast as families feel the shock of rising unemployment, collapsing confidence, and financial stress hitting every corner of the country. What was once called a controlled economic transition is now looking like an economic crisis that is impossible to ignore.
Laying the foundations for a stronger, more resilient, more independent Canadian economy. That process is settling in during that time as we make major investments, major changes. As we do all that, the data is going to be uneven.
This is the point where I think every Canadian has to slow down and actually take in what is happening. Because the gap between what people are being told and what they are living through has become too wide to ignore.
The Prime Minister's obviously been hiding from all of you since the devastating news that we were all saddened to learn on Friday that Canada was the only country in the G7 to have fallen into a recession.
Well, you know, the thing is that consumer confidence has been weak for almost more than a year, and we're basically at the neutral point. You know, it's at around 50.7 out of the 100-point scale, which means it's almost perfectly neutral. It speaks to the fact.
For months, the message was simple. The economy is adjusting, it is stabilizing, it is moving toward a stronger long-term path. But then the label changed, and it changed in a way that carries weight no government can really soften. Recession. And what makes it even harder to ignore is the claim that Canada was the only G7 country to fall into one.
While Canadians are starving, losing their jobs, and missing mortgage payments, and Mark Carney has created the only G7 economy in a recession, he is hiding from accountability.
If I am being honest, most Canadians did not need that label to tell them something was off. They were already living it. Grocery bills were rising in a way that forced constant trade-offs. Housing was already out of reach for many. Savings were shrinking instead of growing. So by the time the official word arrived, a lot of households had already been feeling that pressure for a long time.
2.2 million people relying on food banks, a record-smashing number. Real people are suffering in a way that they're not suffering in the other G7.
That is why the government response became such a focal point. After days of pressure, the explanation finally came. And what stood out to me was not just the content of it, but the direction it took.
You know, we see some weakness, in part because of clear decisions by the government. So we have taken back control of immigration. That's meant the population growth has flattened. In fact, it's slowed.
Instead of fully rejecting the idea of weakness, the argument leaned into it. It suggested that part of this slowdown is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate decisions. Immigration growth has been pulled back. Population growth has slowed sharply, even flattening or turning negative in recent quarters. Government spending growth, which once ran close to 10%, has been reduced to under 2%.
We have reined in government spending, so it had been growing close to 10%. It's growing less than 2% now. So that's also something that weighs on. There's some other choppiness in terms of how investment is happening.
The message behind that is clear. This is not chaos. This is control. The idea is that these choices are meant to rebuild the economy into something more stable and independent over time. Now, that might sound reasonable in theory, especially if you are looking at it from a distance. But it starts to feel very different when you bring it back to real life. Because that same period of transition also lines up with 112,000 job losses in just 3 months. And I cannot treat that as just a number. That is a massive shock hitting real people at the same time. People who now have to rethink rent, mortgages, childcare, and basic stability almost overnight.
Many thousands of Canadians who are part of the 32% increase in delinquencies, mortgage delinquencies, the highest in nearly 2 decades.
And then there is the mortgage situation, where delinquencies have reportedly risen by 32%, reaching levels not seen in nearly 2 decades. That is not something that happens casually. And if you want the clearest sign of pressure, it is probably this. Food bank usage has climbed to 2.2 million people. That number is so large that it stops feeling like a statistic and starts feeling like a warning sign about how stretched households really are.
It's been weak for the better part of a decade. The trade war made it weaker still, but look, this has been an incredibly difficult year for an awful lot of Canadians.
What makes this even more sensitive is how the government frames it. The message is essentially that this pain is temporary and necessary, and that stronger foundations will emerge later. But that kind of argument only works when people feel like they still have space to breathe in the present. Right now, a lot of Canadians do not feel that space.
And many Canadians are holding their breath, wondering what the future will have in store in terms of the economy. And, the kicker is there's a significant regional variation.
And that is where the real tension sits, because it becomes a question of trust more than economics. If you are not the one who lost a job, or missed a mortgage payment, or had to visit a food bank, it is easy to talk about long-term resilience. It is much harder when you are living inside the short-term pressure. That is why this debate is getting sharper. On one side, this is described as a necessary reset that will strengthen the economy over time. On the other side, it feels like Canadians are paying a very real cost for decisions that may not be delivering immediate relief. And the uncomfortable truth is that both sides are now waiting for the same thing: proof.
Heather, even representatives of the Bank of Canada today said, don't get overly concerned about a recession right now. We call it a technical recession. It is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, but GDP is kind of a blunt measure. It captures a lot of things, and sometimes its data isn't perfect in terms of telling us how we're doing. In this case, a big jump in imports actually dragged the number down.
If the economy stabilizes and improves, this will be remembered as a painful but intentional transition. But if it does not, then people will not remember the explanations. They will remember the jobs lost, the rising debt, and the growing number of families struggling just to get through the month. Even before official recession discussions, the cost of living kept climbing. Rent became harder to manage. Grocery bills kept rising. Interest rates increased sharply, but wages did not keep pace in the same way. So even in periods where economic reports looked stable on paper, many households felt like they were slowly falling behind in real life.
In the province of Ontario, the industrial heartland of the country, it is in negative territory. Consumer confidence is at 45 points out of 100, and it probably speaks to the uncertainty in the binational relationship.
That gap between statistics and lived experience is where frustration grows. Because when your paycheck does not stretch as far as it used to, economic growth feels meaningless. And for younger Canadians and first-time homebuyers, that frustration has been building for a long time. For them, it has not felt like an economy moving forward. It has felt like an economy getting further out of reach. So when recession news finally arrives, it does not feel like a shock. It feels like confirmation of something they already suspected. And then we get to one of the most worrying signals in the entire picture: mortgages.
Some of the big things, and this will feel obvious to people, is housing, jobs, business investment. I will say business investment remains weak in this country, and that's directly tied to that trade war and the uncertainty around it. On housing and jobs, we're actually doing pretty well, and that might be surprising, but the data show that stability is really the word you would use. The labor market's been okay.
Reports showing a 32% rise in mortgage delinquencies are not something to brush aside. That kind of movement tells you that pressure is no longer just theoretical. It is becoming financial stress that people cannot absorb anymore. For years, housing in Canada was treated as the safest form of wealth. Prices went up, equity built up, and homeowners felt secure. It was more than just property. It was financial stability. But that sense of certainty has started to weaken.
Wage growth has been super solid. That actually matters a lot to people who have jobs, and the churn hasn't been bad. The housing market is actually holding its own and has gotten slightly more affordable. So in a way, a kind of a Goldilocks scenario of landing in the right place.
Higher borrowing costs changed the entire structure of the market. Mortgages became more expensive. Buying power dropped. And in many regions, prices stopped rising the way they used to.
And the thing is that even when the Prime Minister talks about diversifying the economy, basically what that means is that a signal for change, that the Canadian economy has to change to be more resilient. And whenever people hear about change, they wonder about what it means for their own jobs.
Now, when housing stops growing or begins to decline, something psychological happens that is often more important than the numbers themselves. People start realizing that their biggest financial asset is no longer guaranteed to grow. And that shift alone changes behavior. Even if someone is still making payments, confidence starts to fade. Spending slows down. Big purchases get delayed. Renovations are put off. Families become more cautious with money in general. And that caution spreads beyond housing very quickly.
Economies, and it speaks to the fact that it's a top priority for Premier Ford in order to have certainty on that binational relationship. And I think for a lot of Ontarians, they're wondering, where will the trade relationship be, not just in 6 months, but in a year?
Because when homeowners feel uncertain, they reduce spending in other parts of the economy. Retail feels it. Construction feels it. Small businesses feel it. And slowly, that pressure builds into a wider slowdown. That is how housing stops being just a sector issue and becomes an economy-wide issue. The question becomes how much more pressure it can take before something has to give.
And these new numbers from Statistics Canada released this morning show that's where we are right now. Canada's real GDP in the first quarter of 2026, so January, February, March, declined by 0.1%.
There is one number in this entire situation that honestly feels heavier than all the others combined, and that is 2.2 million people relying on food banks. That is not just an economic indicator. That is not something you casually scroll past. That is a line that tells you something has shifted deeply in everyday life. Because food banks do not reflect theory. They do not reflect political messaging or long-term projections. They reflect reality in its rawest form. They show what happens when paychecks stop stretching, when rent eats too much of income, and when grocery bills start feeling like a negotiation every single week.
I will say this, one reason the Bank of Canada is commenting, a huge chunk of our domestic economy is consumer spending, household spending. How we feel makes a big difference around that, and we can talk ourselves into a recession. So when the Bank of Canada says, don't get overly concerned here, what they're saying is, don't let it be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And here is what makes it even more uncomfortable. This is not just about people who are unemployed. A large part of this pressure is hitting working Canadians too. People who wake up, go to work, come home exhausted, and still find themselves needing help to get through the month. That is the part that really changes the tone of this entire conversation. Because when working families start relying on food banks at record levels, it stops being a simple unemployment story. It becomes a cost of living story, a stability story, a survival story.
The Canadian economy sharply underperformed against what was the Bay Street consensus. Economists in the private sector were all expecting a growth rate of 1.5%.
And while this is happening, the government is also making another major shift that did not get nearly enough attention at first. Immigration growth has been reined in. Population growth, which once acted like a hidden engine for economic expansion, has slowed down significantly.
Because right now, that's all we know is that there is uncertainty. People do not know where we'll be in 6 months or a year on the trade front. And I think that particular anxiety probably touches a raw nerve among consumers in Ontario.
Now, for years, Population growth has helped keep demand strong. It supported housing markets, it supported consumption, and it helped the economy feel like it was always moving forward. But when that growth slows suddenly, the system loses a layer of momentum it was quietly depending on. And that is where the risk comes in. Because if an economy becomes too dependent on constant population growth, then slowing it down can expose weaknesses that were always there but hidden. Suddenly, demand cools, housing pressure shifts, businesses feel the difference, and the overall pace of activity starts to look very different. At the same time, there has also been a noticeable shift in government spending. Growth in spending, which was previously running at much higher levels, has been significantly slowed. The argument is simple on paper. After years of expansion, fiscal restraint was necessary. The idea is to bring discipline back into the system.
So 1/10 of a percentage point. You add that to the -1% change in GDP in the last quarter of 2025, and voila, you've got 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, putting us into a recession.
But here is the uncomfortable question that follows. What happens when you slow spending at the same time that households are already under pressure? Because government spending is not just a number on a balance sheet. It flows into jobs, services, infrastructure, and local economies. When that flow slows, the impact does not stay in one place. It spreads.
It's kind of like people are holding their breath, wondering what's going to happen in terms of the Canadian economy. That's all they do know, is that there will be change.
And this is where the debate becomes sharp. One side says this is a necessary discipline that will strengthen the economy in the long run. The other side says it is removing support at exactly the wrong time, making an already fragile situation worse. That disagreement leads directly into what many people are now calling the two Canadas. While statistics may show adjustments and transitions, households are dealing with rent, groceries, debt, and uncertainty. That gap between policy language and lived experience is where trust starts to weaken. And once that trust weakens, even good policies become harder to accept. This is why frustration has been building. If things improve over time, this period will be remembered as difficult, but necessary. A rough adjustment that paid off later. But if things do not improve, then the interpretation changes completely. It becomes a story of avoidable pain, missed signals, and economic misjudgment on a large scale. And that brings everything to one final question. How much economic pressure can Canadians realistically absorb before they stop accepting the idea that this is all part of a long-term plan?